Howdy, y'all. Welcome to the EEARSS Podcast, produced at Terrier TV. I am Frank Robb. That is Bill Curtis. And right now we are the EEARSS Podcast. Very much missing Cindy.
Yes, we are.
Yep. Hope everything's going good for them right now. Bill, how's the week been treating you?
It's been it was a short week because we had Labor Day.
It was Labor.
It was Labor Day.
It was Labor Day week.
Friday kind of snuck up on us. But it's
my week's been so busy I forgot we had Labor Day on Monday.
Well, sometimes that happens.
It seems to be busier than normal.
You lose track.
Yep, indeed.
And it's been a good week. Kids are good.
Are you videotaping the game tonight?
If it doesn't rain.
Didn't think about that. This will be the first ever game I've went to announce that there was actually a real chance of it raining.
Yeah. Well, I went to the JV game last night. We did the first half. Just watched the first half, and then I left. Second half, it poured.
Yeah, so the team I coach in Vero, well, we went and played in Vero last night.
Okay.
It was like an hour and a half ride.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful down there. There wasn't hardly a cloud in the sky. It was perfect.
Oh, well, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So
yeah,
worked
Vero
out.
was nasty.
Good times. Yeah, it's been a week. I head out to Chicago in the morning. So I do this game at night, get home like 10 o'clock to be in the car on the way to the airport at 4 and jump straight into plane. So it's going to be a busy few days.
What are you doing in Chicago?
Block Club Chicago, which is a nonprofit organization up there, media organization, is holding a street party.
Okay.
Which I've never been to one of them, I don't think.
Okay.
So
didn't we interview somebody from there?
Yeah, we interviewed Seamus, the guy who runs Block Club.
Right, yeah,
Yep.
okay.
So we're gonna go up there, promote EEARSS, promote the nonprofit, the work we're doing, what's going on, our cancer research, all that good stuff.
Right.
Kind of give a little presentation, hand out some hugs, and go to a Cubs game Saturday. Go to a Cubs-Yankees game on Saturday, and then back home Monday.
Cool.
Yeah, should be pretty epic. Be a fun trip. Haley, my niece, is coming up there with me.
Okay.
So yeah,
very good.
should be pretty awesome. All right, you ready to jump into this?
Yeah, let's do it.
So today on the podcast, we are joined by a friend and somebody who's been another inspirational guy, Dr. Matt Shirley. Matt, how you doing, buddy?
Not bad. How are you guys?
Doing great. So for those who don't know your name, shame on them, and tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, so I know Rob through the crocodile community. I'm a crocodile scientist. Been doing work with crocodiles of West and Central Africa since about 2001, 2002, I want to say. Working in most countries throughout the region. I did my master's and PhD work over there. Some of the more notable kind of outcomes have been recognizing that there's actually more than 3 crocodile species in Africa, which has been a pretty fun ride, and then trying to figure out the best kind of conservation and management strategies to ensure that they have sustainable futures. And over the course of my time, I've, of course, diversified in the species that I cover. So a lot of my work is very based on species and understanding their relationship to the environment. And, for better or worse, I can't fill all the hours of the day with crocodiles, and so I do a lot of pangolin work these days, which adds several other dimensions. But yeah, it's pretty neat stuff, I think.
Okay, we want to jump to the end of the pangolin conversation here in a second, but I remember texting you one day. It was a couple of years ago. I'm in Chicago, Bill. Get this. I'm in Chicago in a cab. The cab driver knows who I am.
Okay.
And he's talking to me. He's like, "Hey, I'm from this small village in West Africa called Paga," and he's like, "I met this guy here in my village that might work with you." He's like, we don't see a lot of white people come through, and his name was Dr. Matt Shirley. Have you heard of Matt Shirley? And I went, Matt. I'm like, I couldn't believe what was going on. I took a picture with the guy and sent it to Matt because it was just so crazy out of the middle of nowhere that this guy from West Africa called your name out in Chicago. It was very epic.
Yeah, it's true. There's not a lot of us running around that region looking for crocs, and so we tend to be a bit memorable, I think.
That area specifically he's talking about, that's a very historical kind of neighborhood community. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, it's actually a really special village up in the north of Ghana. That's they have a sacred relationship with the crocodiles, and the whole village is kind of built around a crocodile theme. And actually, in the past decade or so, 2 decades, they've really kind of capitalized on the cultural phenomenon to generate some revenue. It's a nice tourist experience, but yeah, it's really cool. I mean, everybody there is super into the crocodiles, and they're really treated quite respectfully. So of course, I had to go see it when I was there.
Yeah, it's from the videos I've seen and the things you see online, it looks quite legendary, without a doubt.
Yeah, yeah. It's
So,
actually one of the more interesting things about West Africa in particular is there's lots of areas that have these cultural relationships with crocodiles that put a lot of importance on them, and for one reason or another. So it's quite an intricate socio-ecological balance for the species, which is really interesting.
and has that been something that's going on there long term?
Oh yeah, this is really long term. I mean, the things, let's say the animistic and sacred relationships with different elements of nature is really core to most West African ethnic groups and traditional culture, traditional religion. And so whether it's a crocodile or a pangolin or any number of other species, it's really it's ingrained in who they are.
They're just much more in tune with the earth and what's going on, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, most people in that region are still living in some ways off the land and directly, I guess, directly dependent on some sort of extractable natural resource. And so it makes a lot of sense. There's not really grocery stores in every corner.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Now, the other topic you just mentioned a minute ago, that you were working with pangolins.
Mhm.
Um, this is an animal that I've always dreamed about the ability of seeing in the wild. I've never seen one other than pictures online, and maybe I saw one on YouTube one time in a video. Maybe I can't say that I've ever actually even heard of a zoo that has one that I can think of. Tell us about this animal for those that don't know about it, and what kind of things that they're facing, their challenges, and I know there's a lot to this whole picture that you're very much part of. I mean, you're kind of the guy.
Yeah. It's pangolins are interesting. And so, I mean, you actually mentioned that you're going up to Chicago here in the very near future. Chicago Brookfield Zoo is one of the only zoos in the country that actually has pangolins these days. So,
What?
highly
Okay.
recommend you stop in and check them out while you're up there. They have white-bellied pangolins, but pangolins are really quite fascinating. For those of you that don't know what they are, it's their other kind of colloquial name is scaly anteaters. And so, for the North American audience, we're all familiar with armadillos. So, if you kind of imagine an armadillo, but instead of one kind of massive shell casing, they have individual scales all over the body, and they do the similar defensive strategy as armadillos. They roll up into a ball to kind of avoid predation, to kind of reduce the access to their vulnerable underbellies, for example. They are entirely myrmecophagous, so they eat exclusively ants and termites. And for millennia, they have been a very highly prized resource for people all around the world in their range states. So there are 8 species. 4 of them occur kind of throughout Africa, and 4 of them occur throughout South and Southeast and East Asia. And almost no matter where you are, people love to eat them. Apparently, they're kind of competing with bacon, for example, for top taste prize. And then a lot of their body parts, in particular their scales, are really heavily implicated in traditional medical practices. And so it's really the combination of, like for most species, deforestation or habitat loss that drives population declines. But with pangolins is much the added pressure of harvest for consumptive purposes, either the meat or selling their body parts for further downstream uses in traditional medicine. And see, about 10 years ago, they became recognized as the most illegally traded wild mammals in the world. And so we're talking about millions of animals, or millions of individuals are extracted from the wild every year and consumed and traded. But it was just recently, again, about 8 years ago, that we started recognizing this crisis and started sitting in legislative mechanisms to potentially stem the tide of the trade. But as Frank was mentioning, they're really difficult animals to see in the wild, and scientists and area managers don't even really know where the hotspot populations are. We're having a very hard time, designing conservation interventions that we think will be effective. And so right now, it's a whole lot of fingers in dam holes, trying to do what we can, but it's tough.
That's it. Yeah, it's unbelievable. I saw where you guys were trying to put transmitters on them too, right?
Yeah. So that's part of the work that we do is better understanding the species in the wild, so their habitat relationships and things like that. And but pangolins are on the one hand, they're very easy to tag, and the other hand, they're very difficult because they have these scales which themselves don't have any nerves or anything. And so the easiest thing to do is just drill a hole in the scale and attach the transmitter with a bolt, for example. But they're really small ones, for example, their scales can be quite delicate, so the scales will break, or the transmitters will fall off. Or if they're climbing up in the trees, they really like kind of like stuffy, heavily vine vegetated kind of areas, and so the antennas on the transmitters get caught up in the vegetation and they'll pull off. And if you're one of the bigger pangolins that are totally terrestrial and live in, they have like underground burrows, I mean, those things will just destroy transmitters, banging them up against the burrow entrances and stuff. So it's a bit challenging, but it's really interesting to see what they do. We've actually even put cameras on them to kind of get a first pangolin perspective as they're moving through the vegetation and living their lives. They're really secretive and really kind of bizarre.
And are they usually moving during the day, or they're a nighttime critter, right? For the most part.
Yeah, for the most part. So across the 8 species, of course, we have a bunch of variations. Some of them are nocturnal, some of them are diurnal, and some of them are really arboreal, some of them are really terrestrial. So it's a bit of a variation. And of course, the more that we study them, the more we find out. So that one species, for example, the white-bellied pangolin, is believed to now be the single most illegally trafficked wild mammal because it's the most traded of the pangolins. And forever we thought that this species was totally nocturnal, and then all of a sudden we're getting camera trap images of it at like noon and 3 in the afternoon. They're rare, but the more you know, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Wow.
There's groups of these things that literally spend time in trees.
Oh yeah. No, so my favorite species, and the one that me and my students have pioneered a fair amount of work on, black-bellied pangolins, and I might be biased, but I think they're also the most attractive. I mean, they're really jet black skin, and they have black and orange and yellow scales. They're really quite pretty, but they are almost exclusively arboreal, and this is actually one of the things that we think is saving them and keeping them out of trade compared to the other species, because they're just way up in the canopies and hunters don't have access to them. And they come down to the ground every once in a while, but we're starting a big program of arboreal camera trapping, for example. So we'll stick camera traps between 10 and 35 meters up into the tree canopies, and that's where we're actually getting a lot more detections of these guys, and it's starting to explain a lot.
So are they smaller? I mean, are their hands built different? What? So there's 8 species. Can you give me like a breakdown of some of the anatomical differences between them?
Yeah, so we kind of classify them into 3 eco groups, you can say. So there's the fully terrestrial species. These tend to be really big. And so, for example, the giant pangolins, which is native to West Central and just barely into East Africa, like they get into Kenya in certain parts, it's huge. I mean, the biggest one on record is like 48 kilograms. So for the non-metric audience, it's about 100 pounds.
It's a big animal.
It's a big animal, right? And I remember speaking to one of my colleagues who ended up being one of the first people to put a transmitter in a giant pangolin. This is in Uganda. They said, I mean, they found one, and it took five grown men to even just keep it from walking off. So imagine it's like a tank just barreling through you, and they have really big scales. So the scales themselves, imagine they can fill the palm of the palm of a hand of a grown man, right? So these are really, really big. If the thing weighs 40 to 45 kilos, it's got a scale mass of about 4 kilos. It's like 10 pounds. About 10% of the body mass is scales. And their tail is really short. They have, just like massive front claws that they use to dig out termite nests and to dig out their burrows and stuff. That compares to the black-bellied pangolin I just mentioned a second ago. The maximum weight on those things is like 5 pounds. Give or take, and they're much smaller. They curl up, and like a curled up black-bellied pangolin will fit in my hand, basically. So it's quite a big variation. Their tails, of course, are much longer because they basically use their tail as a 5th limb, balancing, kind of going up and down trees. We've got video of them kind of going straight up and down tree trunks, using their tail as like an anchor, kind of keeping them from falling off. It's really cool.
Wow, unbelievable. Okay, yeah. So let's backtrack for a second. Tell me where your first interest came. Growing up, what was your interest in wildlife? Go through a little bit of your degree background, how you got to working with crocodilians, and then jump us into the journey of how you got to working with pangolins, because it's got to be an interesting story.
Yeah. Well, I was I think like most wildlife researchers, I was an animal nerd as a kid. I caught my first snake at age 8 or something and put it in a terrarium, and fortunately had very supportive parents. So I grew up doing a lot of camping and hiking with my dad and stuff. And then I think also, like a lot of people who study reptiles, I got into reptiles through the captive reptile trade, right? You know, as a kid, I had floor to ceiling, wall to wall terrariums in my bedroom, for example, with snakes and lizards everywhere. And you know, I kind of, as someone who's interested in science but didn't really know a lot about what goes on in the world, I kind of went into college thinking, yeah, you know, I'll probably be a doctor, and then very quickly realized that let's say compassion for medical mysteries is not my strength, and so decided to switch to wildlife. And you know, of course, as I'm a wildlife conservationist, I quickly realized that conservation really has little to do with wildlife and more to do with compassion for people and communities, and kind of understanding the needs of local people to live in wild areas still. And so I've kind of had to bone up on that aspect as well. But you know, I think I was a sophomore, a junior in college, and I said, you know, this medical stuff isn't for me. And I got the opportunity to work in a genetics lab doing some just an internship on genetics of Galapagos tortoises of all things. And initially, I did a study abroad in Australia where I had a professor there who was really into birds, and so I got into bird watching. And then I did my early research didn't have to do anything with crocodiles or reptiles or pangolins. So I did bird surveys in Central Africa, and that's actually how I would say my interest in crocodilians got really kind of first stoked. I was doing these bird surveys in remote areas of Equatorial Guinea, which is this tiny little country on the Atlantic coast of Central Africa. It's nestled between Gabon and Cameroon. And while we were out in this really remote spot, I was like, hey, I know that there's these really rare crocodilians that most people didn't know anything about. Dwarf crocodiles and center-snouted crocodiles are supposed to be here. And it just so happens that one of the guides that we hired was a crocodile hunter as like one of his like secondary professions. And so we went out looking for dwarf crocs with him at night in these little tiny forest streams in this equatorial African forest. And that was just such a cool experience. And then we kind of left the forest, came back to the town, and started visiting markets there to, you know, just local kind of produce and meat markets, which all have a wild meat, a bushmeat section. So bushmeat and wild meats, like wild animals, they get harvested and then sold. And we just saw a ton of dwarf crocodiles. And, you know, so I kind of started thinking about it, and I was like, oh, you know, some research on, you know, what was Google Scholar didn't exist back then, but basically what is now Google Scholar, and figured out there was nothing known about these animals. Got in touch with the late John Thorbjarnarson and Perrin Ross, actually, both at the University of Florida, and said, hey, I'm interested in crocodiles. I just came back from Equatorial Guinea. By the way, I went through an attempted coup, and Equatorial Guinea is this really challenging place to work. And so I'm your guy. I'm pretty sure I can go back to West or Central Africa and start answering any of these questions. And I was fortunate that both of them took an interest in me, and John in particular had an interest in doing a project looking at understanding the systematics of Nile crocodiles across Africa, right? And so if you look at Africa, it's obviously a very big continent, and it's got mountains and deserts and coastline and all these like features that might impede gene flow across crocodile populations. You know, crocodiles don't really go up to the highest mountains. They're not in the desert, or at least they're not in the now desert, right? And so we thought there might be there might be more, like there might be a cryptic species thing happening there. And it turns out that we were right. So, you know, John took me on as a master's student to do this Nile crocodile systematics work. And in the process of that, we figured out that there's actually two species that people are calling Nile crocodiles. They're not even their closest relatives. They have different numbers of chromosomes, which means that even if you put a male and a female in an enclosure together and they reproduce, they probably wouldn't produce fertile offspring, which has kept them separated for millions and millions of years. And what was really cool about that study is, in order to figure out the name that we were going to give to this species, we actually had to go and extract DNA from crocodile mummies that came out of ancient Egyptian temples. And so we kind of matched a species that was described from these crocodile mummies genetically with what we were finding in West and Central Africa and quote unquote Nile crocodiles. And that's how we ended up with the name Crocodilus for this species. And, you know, it's actually one I wouldn't say it's a big regret, but Crocodilus is a really fascinating species for me. It's probably the most ecologically plastic and diverse crocodilian in the entire world. I mean, it literally occurs in the high Sahara, up in northern places like northern Chad, Mali, and Mauritania, and it occurs all throughout and down into the coastal lagoons of Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal and Gambia and stuff. And so it's just like it occurs across this diversity of ecosystems. You know, we have stories in West Africa, and I've seen this firsthand, where there's no water for, you know, tens if not hundreds of kilometers. Somebody digs a massive watering hole for their livestock or to irrigate their ponds, and within weeks a Crocodilus just shows up, and you're like, where did you come from and how did you even find this, right? I mean, there's such fascinating crocodiles, but they're much lower conservation concern. And so my later career, I focused on slender-snouted and dwarf crocodiles. And West African slender-snouted crocodiles were the primary subject of my dissertation, and we figured out that they're one of the most critically endangered crocodile species in the world, actually. And since then, most of my work is focusing on that. But to make the transition to pangolins, I was one of these kids that grew up as in front of nature documentaries. Right, my parents didn't put me in front of cartoons; they put me in front of like Jacques Cousteau and Animal Planet and everything else. And so I always knew I had all these encyclopedias of animals, and so I always knew that pangolins were out there. And I mean, you see an illustration of a penguin, you're like, this is the weirdest thing in the entire world. I knew they were in Africa. I always wanted to see one, but despite living in pangolin habitat for 15 years, it took me about 15 years to see my first wild one. And then once I saw my first wild one, I was hooked. I was like, I know how to deal with cryptic species, difficult to find species that are harvested for meat and money and everything else. And this is exactly what pangolins are. And so I took my first steps into it. And here I am, 8 years later, chair of the Pangolin Specialist Group. That's weird. How did that happen?
Yeah, it sounds like they knew they had the guy, and that you just you were pushed into it for a good reason.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's growing up as a crocodilian biologist. I would say there's a lot of crocodile people that are fortunate enough to do work with wild crocodilians, and there's a lot of crocodile people that are fortunate enough to do work with captive crocodilians in either zoological or like farming or ranching settings. But I've had the privilege of doing work across both, and crocodilian trade, right? The economic value of crocodiles is such a key factor in ensuring their conservation in the world. And for whatever reason, the pangolin conservation community didn't kind of grow up with that same understanding. And you can understand it. Largely, pangolin conservation today is a crisis. It's a reaction to a crisis, right? And so when you're faced with the crisis of potential unsustainable trade, your first thought isn't necessarily, oh well, how can we leverage this interest in pangolins to their benefit? But the simple reality is millions of people around the world want pangolin for one reason or another. And so why swim upstream? We got to find a way to work with communities to kind of to harvest that interest and leverage it to their conservation benefits. So I think that's why the former chairs of the Pangolin Specialist Group were interested in me in particular, is like coming into it with an alternative perspective, I would say.
A new point of view for things is always good. You were talking a little bit about perceived medical benefits of these animals. Has there been any research done? Is there actually proof behind medical benefits of this animal to human health?
Yes, there has been some research, and biochemically, pangolin scales are literally just keratin. It's like with the same thing as our hair and our fingernails and everything else, and so they're entirely biologically inert, right? So biomedically, there is no linkage to any effective care. But so much of traditional medicine practice is kind of the power of the mind in healing, and the belief that it's working for you. And
isn't that the same thing like with rhino horn? The same thing. It's basically hair.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same material as rhino horn.
Okay.
Yeah. And so really what it means is you're dealing with a very complex situation where culturally these things are very important, and it's not my job to go into some place like Vietnam or China or even the communities that I work with in West and Central Africa and say, well, no, your beliefs are incorrect. Here, look, this is a piece of hair. Eat my hair. Does that do anything for you? And your cultural ideas are dumb and are invalid or not valuable, right? That's not what I should be doing. I should be going in there and figuring out, okay, well, what is the strategy that's going to allow you to maintain your cultural heritage while not risking the natural heritage around you, right? And so it's not really about if it's an effective medicine or not. It's whether these people believe it is, and then, okay, well, how do we harvest that belief, or let's say divert that belief to a harvesting strategy that doesn't impact future sustainability.
It's one of the many things that I've learned from listening to you, is you talking about engaging communities in different ways to improve conservation, and kind of always having somebody in each community that you can really communicate with and have them have those talks for you, instead of having somebody that doesn't look like the people that are there. Have somebody from the community, speaks their language, that they know and they trust, to go in and work on these things. And You have a very vital point there.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, communities, especially communities that are still privileged to live in and around nature, are really the key. And it's, as you say, it's not, it's difficult coming in from the outside, even though, I might have a different exposure to education or, quote unquote facts and data that they do. It doesn't necessarily invalidate their perceptions of the natural world. And so trying to find the language that you can speak. I mean, even if it's all French or even it's all English, just because we're using the same words doesn't necessarily mean they mean the same thing. So really kind of making time to hear what they're saying, helping them understand what you're saying, and finding common ground is the key.
So let's say there's somebody listening that wants to help with conservation of pangolins or learn more about your work, maybe both. Where can they go to find out about that?
Yeah, so I think the Pangolin Specialist Group, the IUCN SSC Pangolin Specialist Group, our website is probably the number one stop for pangolin information. And there, most people that are doing work on pangolins in the world are now members. We've done a really good job of being like open and inclusive and say, okay, look, if you're working on pangolins or you have skill sets that are relevant to pangolin conservation, join our community, help us produce the best guidance that we can produce based on the best data and evidence that we have. And it's usually the people in our community that have that data and evidence. And so that's your best stop for sure. We have a general contact email. You can always shoot us an email, and that will come more or less directly to me, and happy to chat any more specifically about it. But yeah, pangolins and crocodiles for that matter, they all need our help, and they're all, let's say they're kind of off the major conservation agendas of big organizations who a lot of times focus on things like elephants and apes and stuff, which obviously never help as well. But we can't forget all the weird, scaly things in the world.
Everybody likes the little warm, fuzzy things for the most part, don't they? That's just the way it goes.
Sure. For sure.
So 2025 for Matt Shirley, what are big things that you want to accomplish in 2025? What kind of big things do you see coming up?
Oh, that's a really good question. In the crocodile world, we've got a bunch of small, well, it's not really small anymore, but they're juvenile / subadult West African center-sounded crocodiles that we've helped the Ivorian government produce in their National Abidjan Zoo. We'd like to get those animals back out in the wild. One of the things that's been kind of stalling that is we, of course, want to release them with a bunch of tags so that we can figure out if they succeeded or not. And we're trying to produce a low-cost, open-source GPS tag. So right now, if you want to buy a GPS tag off the shelf for crocodile, it's going to cost you between $1,000 and $2,500.
They're stupid expensive.
Yeah, stupid expensive, and so we're hoping to produce a tag that we can make for about $250 that has the same capacity as all these really kind of expensive fancy ones. And so once we get over the engineering hurdles on that, which we're pretty close to, because it's actually the same tag that we're developing for pangolins, it'll just be in a slightly different housing for crocodiles. Then we'll be able to do those releases. And another project that's kind of been really on my mind for the past, I'd say 7 or 8 years is dwarf crocodiles, especially the Congo dwarf crocodiles. This is Osteolaemus osborni. We're in the process of doing a systematic revision of the dwarf crocodiles to fully recognize 3 species. And so Osteolaemus osborni is the one that occurs in the Congo Basin, and that crocodilian is harvested in the 6 figures annually across its range. Like hundreds of thousands are harvested for bushmeat. And what's interesting about this trade is that it's not just consumed locally, but for example, if you're in Northern Republic of Congo in, for example, an area like the Lac-Tele Community Reserve, which is a massive like a multi-use reserve that protects, let's say, 1/3 of the largest peat swamp forest in the world. Those crocodiles are harvested out of that reserve, and they're sent all the way downstream to like Brazzaville and Brazzaville and Kinshasa for consumption by urban elites, for example. And then there's even a study on wild meat, like the global transport in the wild meat sector, and dwarf crocodiles are ending up in like Belgium and France and England and Germany because of the West and Central African community that lives there now. Just people want access to that meat resource. So it's really kind of fascinating. But, this to date, this harvest is non-managed and non-regulated in any way whatsoever, aside from just an overarching legal regulation. So outside of American alligators, these things really are the most harvested by volume crocodilian species in the world. We have no finger on the pulse of what's happening with it, but there are opportunities to do it. And so I'm hoping 2025 is the year we're able to finally get a structured harvest management program, at least in Congo, for that species, which would be really, really cool. And then on the pangolin front, so we've got some goals with the Pangolin Specialist Group. A lot of it has to do with kind of guiding future conservation action for these species. But in addition to my work with the group, I have my own kind of research lab, and where we're doing pangolin work. And so we've got a really big project in Cameroon and Gabon right now, where we're integrating let's say diverse investigative approaches. So we've got, for example, I mentioned a moment ago, arboreal camera trapping. Well, as part of that, we're developing, for example, thermal camera traps, which we're hoping to deploy in trees later. And we think the thermal camera traps might have a better rate of detection for pangolins, for example. And we're also trying to get some. So we're collaborating with a conservation criminologist who herself and her team go out and they actually find people that are involved in the pangolin trafficking and get firsthand perspectives on the why, the when, the how, the wheres of pangolin trafficking. And so effectively what we're trying to do is put together all this diverse information. So information on pangolin populations in the wild, which we're detecting with our technologies, and the information that's coming from trafficking, information that's coming from local communities around the source populations of pangolins. And we're trying to find ways, like really interesting analytical ways, using, for example, artificial intelligence to kind of combine all those data streams to tell us, okay, well, this is how we should be conserving pangolins, right? It's like a novel perspective, and so we're really hoping to get some of that analytics out in 2025, which will be fantastic because Cameroon, Gabon, and the Congos are really kind of the major source areas for pangolins these days. They're also the areas that probably have the most intact pangolin populations on the entire African continent. So if we can get it right there, then we have a good chance at making a future for these guys.
Absolutely incredible, Matt.
Yeah, you sound like you might be a little busy.
Yeah, I kind of joke that I'll sleep when I'm dead, but sadly, I think the more as the days go by, it's less of a joke.
We always think we're busy until we hear somebody throw 2025 out there with that many possible tasks, and you go, well, maybe I'm not as busy as I thought I was.
Wow. Yeah, Matt, how much time do you spend in Africa?
So as I kind of advance in my career, I spend way less time in the field than I would like to. But so right now I'm in about 6 months somewhere where I have programs or where like the interventions of the Pangolin Specialist Group are needed, that sort of stuff, and then about 6 months back home. But before COVID. And actually, it was COVID that was the big kind of turning point for me. I was oftentimes gone for almost as many as 12 months a year, and that had been going on for about 15 years. And then, COVID came. Like I remember in 2020, I actually had plans to be in the field for 9 months, and then all of a sudden that kind of went awry. And then took such a long time for us to get permission to travel again or permission to spend grant money, all that sort of stuff. And then, by then you've kind of altered what you're doing in life, and you're more playing a support role to like my students or the younger members of our community, and that's how I'm able to achieve impact these days instead of running around getting dirty and doing the fun stuff myself.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Matt, I can't tell you thank you enough for taking the time to chat with us. This has been incredible. Again, can you give us an idea where people can go to learn more about both groups and how to help you if they want to help you with your studies?
Yeah, sure. So any information on pangolins, just Google the IUCN Pangolin Specialist Group. That's the best way to find us there. For crocodiles, same thing, IUCN Crocodile Specialist Group. And so within the Crocodile Specialist Group, I'm also the regional chair for West and Central Africa. And then I'm a research assistant professor at Florida International University. You can Google Matt Shirley, FIU, and my programs will come up there. So if you want to talk more about pangolins or crocodiles or West or Central Africa, or just doing crazy stuff in the name of wildlife conservation, feel free to reach out.
You're the man, Matt. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for all you do, and hope we can catch up again here soon, buddy.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, guys, and have a great weekend.
You too, bub. Thank you. Man, the legend of that guy. When I said legend going into it, is that the guy there's not much he doesn't do when it comes to things going on in Africa. I mean, he spends more time there than he does here. It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, it's neat.
When I first met Matt, we actually met in Argentina, and I kind of just was like enamored by the guy the first time I met him. When we just started talking about wildlife in general and the things he had been doing, and I've known for the past 3 seasons that I wanted the opportunity to get him on here and chat with him, and it's great to finally be able to do it.
Oh,
so,
he's fascinating.
We are starting off this year, this season, with some pretty incredible people.
Oh yeah.
I don't know. It's we are really blessed to talk to some incredible human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Bill. I guess I'll see you in about 5 minutes for our next episode, even though people don't realize that.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, buddy.
So that camera.
Oh, very much.
Tell them your stuff.
Guys, this is my stuff. Listen closely. Thank you all for tuning to the EEARSS Podcast here at Terrier TV. If you would like to sponsor or support our program, you can go over to EEARSS.org or that same address, EEARSS.org@gmail.com. Send us your information so we can call and chat with you. We average between 3,500 and 5,000 views a week. We can promote you. You can get your name on here. We can talk about you to end an episode, to begin an episode. Maybe you can even go over there and sit down beside us and we can talk to you about what you do. Let us know. Let us know guests you might possibly want to see. And hey, we're here. We'll catch you all next week. Bye-bye.